Welcome to 20th Century Music and Arts. So far, in all my videos, I've looked solely at music, and not much of any of the other arts. But that's going to change with this episode. In the next few videos that I'm going to produce, they are going to be on horror movies. More particularly, horror movies of the 1970s. I am a huge horror movie fan. One of the reasons I enjoy horror movies so much is that this genre of film captures and explores the social anxieties and the cultural zeitgeist of the time period that they are made in. For example, in the 1950s, the films made then reflected the tensions of the Cold War and the fear of atomic weapons. In the 1960s, mental illness and revamped versions of classic monsters became part of the cinematic landscape. Now, the film world is always behind the advancements in other arts like music or visual arts. So it would take some time for the social revolutions of the 1960s to really make their way into horror movies. But by the 1970s, this influence was now present. As a result of the success of films like The Graduate and Easy Rider in the late 1960s, directors were given greater artistic freedom than before, and deeper, darker, and more existential subject matter was explored in cinema. It was in this environment in the 1970s that horror movies were able to thrive and push the boundaries. In this series, I am going to look at 20 different films that are my favorites from that decade, many of which are not very well known. Then I'm going to look at the top 4 films, which are all very well known, in the final episode. I'm going to do my best not to spoil any of the movies that I analyze. So I'm not going to give you a full plot recap. I'm going to leave some things out because ultimately I want you to go and enjoy these films and not have too many surprises. Or I want you to have some surprises and not have any spoilers. The first film that we are going to look at is Let's Scare Jessica to Death. The film came out in 1971 and captures the essence of that early 70s spooky vibe. It was directed by John Hancock and was a radical change from the original screenplay, which was written by Lee Catchum, which was about a group of hippies being attacked by a lake monster. When director Hancock rewrote the script, which had been purchased by producer Charles B. Moss, he ended up creating a very unique story. The story is about the protagonist, Jessica, who's played by Zora Lambert, who was recently released from a mental institution. She's going to stay with her husband, Duncan, played by Barton Heyman, who is also a bassist for the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra, and their sort of hippie friend, Woody, who's played by Kevin O'Connor. And they're going to stay at a farm that Duncan recently purchased. The plan is to create a working farm in rural Connecticut. The foreshadowing of something going wrong here is the word peace that is written on the vehicle they are driving, which happens to be a hearse. Given not the warmest welcome by the locals, the trio is further surprised when they encounter a squatter at the farmhouse. They meet the dark and enigmatic woman, Emily, who's played by Claire Costello, who at first seems to be the kind of hippie girl who got caught up in the tune-in, turn-on, drop-out phenomenon. But things start getting strange. The problem is trying to decide if everything is happening as a result of Jessica having a mental breakdown and what she sees are hallucinations, or if in fact there had been a girl who drowned on the property a century ago and is now a vampire who roams the area feeding on the locals. What is very unnerving about this film is the inner dialogue of Jessica that the audience can hear. They'll hear her inner thoughts while she does things. As Jessica is told by Duncan that he finds Emily attractive, her paranoia increases. They encounter a mute girl played by Gretchen Colbert. Emily seems not very interested in Woody's advances, and Jessica notices the men in town all seem to have bandaged wounds, like they've been supplying blood to a vampire. And at the center of all this insanity is Emily, who may be the girl who drowned on the property and is now a member of the blood-sucking undead. The film has elements of horror films like Repulsion or The Haunting, and takes cues from horror literature like Henry James's Turn of the Screw, or Irish novelist Sheridan Le Fanu's Camellia, which tells the story of a horrific female vampire guest. The film is also an early example of showing the naive attitudes of the hippie generation that was quite frankly crashing and burning by 1971. 3 years later, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre would really expand on this idea in a far more graphic way. What I found engaging about Let's Scare Jessica to Death is how uneasy the film makes the viewer, as there is no absolute certainty about what is actually happening. Stephen King states that this is one of his favorite horror movies, and I cannot recommend this film enough. The next film I would like to look at is Deathdream, or Dead of Night, which was directed by Bob Clark. This will be the first of 3 Bob Clark movies that I will analyze in this series. The film was shot in the fall of 1972 in Brocksville, Florida, but did not receive a theatrical release until 1974. Bob Clark was using Canada as a home base for tax purposes, and this would be part of the Canucksploitation category of horror flicks based out of the Great White North. The film is loosely based on W. Jacobs' classic horror short story, The Monkey's Paw. The premise of the film is that after getting a visit from the local U.S. military representative, who gives them a letter informing that their son Andy has been killed in Vietnam, Andy's family, particularly his mother, is completely distraught, and she refuses to accept the reality of the situation. But soon, Andy shows up at the front door. Andy's mother, Christine, who again never accepts the reality of the situation, is particularly overjoyed. When the family states that they were told Andy was dead, he states, "I was," which the family takes as a joke. Now, at the beginning of the movie, you do actually see Andy being killed in Vietnam. But it soon becomes apparent that everything is not right with Andy, as in one scene he simultaneously attacks a neighborhood kid and kills the family dog. Furthermore, Andy might be responsible for the death of a trucker who had given him a lift back home. His father is especially unnerved by Andy's behavior, so he tries to convince his son to get an examination from a family friend who is a doctor. Andy at first refuses, but he finally goes to the doctor's office at night by himself, demanding that he get an examination. In a disturbing scene, it becomes apparent that Andy actually has no pulse.
I want you to know, Doc, that I'm in perfect health. There's not a living soul in better health than I am. I don't have to worry about getting sick, or old, or tired, or hungry, or anything. Well, maybe one thing.
What do you mean, Andy?
Feel my pulse, Doc.
Andy, I
Feel it.
don't understand.
Open it.
What do you...
Open it! Listen to my heart, Doc.
Andy, there isn't any...
Heartbeat, Doc. No heartbeat.
This film has one of the most unique approaches to the subject of the undead that I have ever seen in a horror film. Furthermore, the film explores the elements of the Freudian Oedipus complex, as the mother cannot reject her zombie son, while the father wants to stop his son from killing more people. This film has truly one of the most unique endings to a horror film that I've ever seen. The film explores also the horrific PTSD that Vietnam veterans struggled with while they were trying to integrate back into civilian life. And also the tragedy that the families who were impacted by having their loved one killed in a war that, quite frankly, the American population had become disillusioned with. The final film we are going to look at and examine is Lemora, which was also known as Lemora, A Child's Tale of the Supernatural, or The Legendary Curse of Lemora, or Lemora, Lady Dracula. Out of all three movies, this is the most unseen of the three. This film was directed by Richard Blackburn, who also plays the role of the Reverend. He was inspired by the 1970 film Count Yorga Vampire. The film was shot in Pomona, California, and debuted in April 1973 at the Garrison Theater on the Scripps College campus. The film was quickly sold to the Media Cinema Group because Blackburn felt that the audience did not react well to the movie. So these distributors edited the movie down from 118 minutes to 80 minutes, and it eventually started getting shown across the US in December 1974. But more kind of like midnight showings, not getting a big mainstream release. Now, while the movie was panned at the time, it has gotten a cult following, and with good reason. The film has a unique spin on the vampire story and combines it with Southern Gothic setting and addresses some very uncomfortable subject matter. The movie stars Cheryl Smith, who would later be known as Rainbow Smith, playing the lead role of 14-year-old Lila Lee. Smith was actually 18 at the time of the filming. She is the daughter of a notorious gangster in the Prohibition era, which is where the movie takes place, time period-wise. She has been raised by the Reverend for 3 years of the local church, and she is considered a person of pure moral character now, despite having a criminal father. When her father is captured by a strange woman and her minions, Lila is sent a letter saying to visit her injured father because he is slowly dying. Lila leaves in the middle of the night, and was probably motivated to escape her situation as the Reverend has repressed feelings of desire for her. After hiding in the back of a car, she arrives in a town where she witnesses a kind of cultural Sodom and Gomorrah. She ends up taking a strange bus trip where the driver is attacked by these strange-looking, deformed, almost werewolf-like creatures. However, a pale figure comes on the bus and kills one of the creatures. She wakes up in the middle of a room with bars, and an ugly maid comes in who sings an eerie song, and there are laughing children looking at her.
There was an old woman, all skin and bones, and she did weep and she did moan, she walked on through the streets of town, where all the dead lay on the ground, then turning to the parson said, will I look like that when I am dead? The parson to the old woman said, oh, Lord!
She managed to escape from the farmhouse that she's stuck in, and she thinks she hears the sound of her father. However, she soon meets Lemora, a woman who informs her that she cannot see her father until she is immune to his disease. Lemora's house also has other children who are thin and pale like herself. What becomes apparent is that Lemora is a vampire who desires Lila and feeds on the blood of children. But there are other deformed-looking vampires who, again, more look like werewolves, who are fighting against Lemora, one being Lila's father, who actually tries to attack Lila a couple of times as well. The Reverend shows up to try and find Lila. The movie has a truly twisted ending. This film has not only an original spin on the vampire tale, but the low budget adds to the overall vibe of the film. It's like a merger between art house and exploitation, and maybe it wasn't successful because it didn't quite fit in either one of those categories. The epic battle scene between the two types of vampires seems to come out of nowhere, and might have made more sense in the original 118-minute version of the film. Now, the film did not do very well, and in fact, it was banned by the Catholic Legion of Decency. The film also became notoriously difficult to watch. VHSs would come out here and there. Apparently, there was a version from Japan that had the 118-minute version of the film, but that was difficult to get, and it's never gotten a Blu-ray re-release, though it can be viewed online sometimes. Now, unfortunately, main actress Rainbow Smith would pass away in 2002 after spending decades addicted to heroin. Now, with its dealing with uncomfortable subject matter and its original take on the vampire themes, Lemora was a film way ahead of its time. These three films, while not massively successful, each examine the original approach that filmmakers had in the 70s. The artistic freedom that was given to filmmakers then allowed them to really explore unique themes. They put a modern spin on classic horror, whether it was through vampires or zombies. I would recommend watching all of these movies, and they would make a great triple feature. On the next episode of 20th Century Music and Arts, I'm going to continue to explore horror movies from the 1970s, which in my opinion was the best decade for horror films. Thank you.